Okay, so welcome back to the second part in my Source Direct breakdown series, and today, before I even go into all of the drum break processing and the stuff I did for this project, I actually want to give you a quick overview of all of the drum break processing techniques that I use and then I think are viable, and kind of run you through from start to finish all of the things you can use to make your breaks sound fat and punchy and get them rolling in the way that Source Direct did. So to start with, what we've always got to do in the beginning is one of kind of three techniques, I think, of warping our breaks to our project tempo. Now, if you look here, my project tempo is at 170 BPM, and this is a 2-bar break. So I've already chopped up this part of the amen to be exactly 2 bars. The first thing, and probably the easiest thing to do in a DAW like Logic, is to use one of these time stretching algorithms. And if I hit this flex time in Logic, I can activate it. And then here I'm on this polyphonic stretching, but actually the slicing algorithm is a lot better for drums, and it's going to really preserve the transient detail of your drum breaks a lot better if you use this slicing algorithm. So super easy in Logic. I can just drag this into this 2-bar section, and now I have the same amen break going at 174 BPM. Cool. So the other way, and this is a bit more of an old school method, and Source Direct definitely would do this in their tracks, is actually to use pitching and to take this original break here. And in Logic, what you would do is, let's get this open. In Logic, all I've done is just drag this drum break into Quick Sampler just to load it in there. And then what I've actually done here, if I mute all this stuff away, I've come into Quick Sampler and I've just pitched up the break, and I've got my loop going, and I've just been listening to the break and kind of pitching it up. And you can hear the way it doesn't loop around nicely, so you've got to keep going and really try and fine tune it, and eventually you can get to the right pitch that's going to loop perfectly in a 2-bar loop. But actually that's a bit of an old school method of doing it, and there's a lot easier way to do that in Logic and Ableton and DAWs like this now, is to use another algorithm from Flex, and this one is the speed algorithm. So rather than slicing, which isn't going to change the pitch, the actual speed algorithm is going to pitch up the break to make it walk to your tempo. Easy. So that's obviously a much more effective way of pitching your breaks up to your tempo than having to do it manually like they used to back in the day. And then finally, and I have actually detailed all of these techniques in a video I did a while ago, so there'll be a little link in the top right hand corner, but is this technique I like to call gate to tempo. And I do this a lot in Renoise, and I've showed it in there a lot, but I've never shown how to do it in another DAW like Logic. And so what you got to do is chop all the hits up at their transient, so everything including the shuffles, all the hits like I have here, and then you go right click in Logic and convert to new sampler track, okay, and then create the new sampler track. And then another trick I like to do here is I do Control and Shift and press down, and that's going to go to the bottom of this audio region, and then I can just select this and chop it. And what I'm really doing is just matching this MIDI exactly to the length of the audio. And so what I can then do is just stretch the MIDI to fit this 2-bar passage. But one weird thing that Logic does is it actually adds fades. So one final thing you got to do is go in here and go show the zone list column, and then open sample, come into this zone view, if I come up a bit, and then I've actually got to scroll across until I find fade in and fade out, and then just select them all and get rid of these fades. So that's a really annoying thing that Logic does. And now we've got this break running at our song tempo, but what we've actually done is not pitch it up, and we've not done any time stretching to it. So we're completely preserving the transient detail, but we're just chopping the tails off all of the audio hits, as if we'd kind of taken all these hits and just nudged them a bit like this and then put them back together. that's what it's doing, but it's still going to have warped the brake to our song tempo. So I think that's another very viable method for warping your brakes to your BPM. So the next thing we need to consider is if we actually want to quantize our brakes or not. And generally here, most people, I would say, would be quantizing their kicks and snares definitely bang on the grid. And then whether you quantize your shuffles or not is really about personal preference. But one thing I do want to stress is that if you just come in here and kind of put markers in like this in Logic and use the warp markers as they are, you're never going to get as tight a brakes as if you do everything manually. And it's just the same as having to chop your brakes by hand and actually chop out each slice. You've really got to come in with your flex markers and really detail exactly where you want all the hits to happen. And so here I've come in and kind of put perfect chopping points everywhere in this break, whereas if I come to this one I just did quickly and automatically, you can see it's like that's in quite a weird place there, and that's might generate clicks and pops. That's not in an ideal place there. And if I come, maybe I can find a really bad one like that's just put it right in the middle of kind of the build of their drum hit. So using the automatic algorithms is never going to be as good as doing things by hand. One final thing I think is important to mention here is if you want to actually preserve some of the swing of the hits, a good way to do this is actually to offset the slice marker. So you can see here I've put the slice marker bang on the grid. So I'm looking at the top and I can see that this is bang on the grid, and then there's hits actually coming after the slice marker. And so this actually means that when I slice this break all up like I've done here, so all I've done here is kind of copy this over and then sliced it at my flex markers and then converted that to a MIDI region. But what you can see here is I can program my MIDI exactly on the grid. So the MIDI is going to be quantized, but actually some of the audio is offset. So you can offset the hits, but then programming actually quantized is way easier and more effective than having to like nudge bits of MIDI around, and that's really tedious. So I think this is a much better workflow. If you want to use shuffled hits, then maybe offset the actual slice markers so you can program in a quantized fashion. So the final thing to consider with our breaks before we do some more in-depth processing is if we want them in stereo or mono. And for me personally, I would almost always have them in mono because I just think they sound a little bit more upfront and direct when they're banging straight down the middle. Now, this BX control is a really useful way of doing this because you can not only choose the left or the right, but you can choose a balance between the left and the right and then actually make the whole break mono. So what I've done here is just take the stereo width down to mono, and then if I loop the break, you can hear how different in the amen the actual left and the right or sides of the break sound, and the left is a bit brighter and the right's a bit darker. Okay, so now we've got through the preparation stage, we can get into some more of the processing, and I'm just going to rattle through lots of things now, and I'm not going to go into too much detail because here I'm just trying to paint a picture of all the tools that are available to you without having to go and spend 10 minutes explaining each one. So firstly, let's start with EQ, and EQ is always going to be the most important tool to tonally shape your breaks to sound the way you want them. A very common EQ that you will see everyone using is a parametric EQ like this one in Logic called Channel EQ, or the Pro Q by FabFilter is an amazing one as well. But these EQs are great for removing resonances and for just doing general EQ moves like cutting the low end and doing little dips in the muddy area between like 200 Hz and 500 Hz. All these kind of very common moves are really easy to do on an EQ like this. But actually, if you're boosting or you want to find some more interesting EQ settings, something like this one by Sound Toys, the SIEQ, or this one by Waves is actually really good as well. And often by using these things where you're not using your eyes as much and you use your ears more, you can find more interesting EQ results. And they definitely give you, because they're modeled on vintage equipment, they will give you slightly better tones and coloring when you're boosting. And one final EQ that I do think is worth mentioning here is actually graphical EQs. And I picked this one up quite recently from Kazog. It's got 7 bands, but especially when you map an EQ like this to a MIDI controller, so all the faders are lining up, you can really just close your eyes and do everything by ear, and you will stumble into different EQ results than you would if you're kind of bound by those parametric ones just by the way you think that certain things should be done or should sound, and so you maybe don't make as bolder EQ moves as if you're just doing something with a graphical EQ. Another very useful tool to tonally shape your breaks is to use filters, and this one by Sound Toys called Filter Freak is a great filter because it has all these analog algorithms in there, and so you can use them. They're going to add saturation and compression and things like that as well on top of the filtering you're doing. But two really common techniques that I see a lot, and I actually see if I show you these two breaks by Source Direct quickly, just so we have a reference point. This first one is from their track Exit 9, and the second one is from the Crane, and you can hear how much filtering is going on in these two breaks. So especially the Exit 9 one is super filtered, the EQ, and they're pulling a lot of the low end away from the break. But a common technique that Paradox would use, and I'm sure Photek did as well if I went back through his work, is to filter your drum breaks and then to layer a fat subby kick underneath. So you can hear there I've just pulled it away from the kick frequency of this break, and it just seems to separate the two sounds, and it just gives you a cooler response than just layering like a big kick straight under your original kick. It's just a more interesting way of doing things. And just with that little bit of compression as well, I think helps to really give you that similar sound to Source Direct there. And then another really common filtering move is to use a low pass filter and to actually just have a little bit of resonance, and then you can mess with this high frequency and you can actually just use it. It acts a little bit like a top end boost. Like a high shelf, but you end up rolling down as well, and because it's going through a filter, it's just going to give you a slightly different response to if you did this with an EQ, especially if one like Filter Freak is just going to give you a more interesting kind of tone in the high frequencies there. So what I do is kind of set this at like a mid, so you can get something that's going to sound more like you're even exciting the break a little bit, but you can use this to control the brightness in the hi-hats and things like that. So that's too much filtering there. So compression is always a tricky one, and definitely it's something that I struggled for ages learning where to use it and not overdoing it and just getting it right. But I will say that you don't always have to use compression. But Source Direct definitely did use a lot of compression in their breaks. And maybe rather than me kind of breaking down all the controls and things like that, I just want to give you the three main reasons I'm using compression on my breaks. The first thing I will do is use a slower attack and a fast release. And this is like an SSL modded style compression, but slow attack, fast release, and then kind of a 2:4 ratio. And I'm going into the controls now, but slow attack, fast release, and then I'm using this to add punch to the breaks. So you're letting the attack part through, and then you're clamping on the body, and that's going to add punch to the sound or increase the peak to body ratio of the break. And then the second thing I will do is I will actually want to control the transient. So here I will use a much faster attack time, and then I will actually probably always move the threshold up a little bit, so I'm having less compression. And I'm just going to chop the tops or compress the peaks, the transient peaks of the break, and that's going to give me more headroom. So therefore I can pull the peaks down, I can make the whole break louder. And then finally, the last thing I like to use a compressor for is actually for glue or the character of the particular compressor I'm using. And this is especially important if you chop your break up and it's not sounding that cohesive, or you're pulling lots of elements from different drum sounds and one shots together. Using a compressor can really help make the break sound like it's from the same place. So if you don't actually want to use a compressor on your tracks, you do have some other options. And one thing I do a lot, even if I'm using a compressor sometimes, is clip gaining. And this will be different in any DAW you do, but in Logic you have this option actually here, which is the region option, and you can just select any region and see I've added like 3 dB to these ones, and I've added 1.5 to these, and you can go in manually and select regions. And I think there's even like a tool now, a gain tool, but I like to kind of have this little pop-up. So here I have a hotkey, so I can bring this pop-up up, and then I can just select things and add and take away gain. So you can manually do some of the level balancing that is part of compression. You can do here with clip gain. So I think that's another very useful option to think about. Saturation is another really important way to tonally shape your breaks and to make them sound fat and warm and crunchy. And so there's loads of different types of saturation you can use. Tape saturation is a great one. I also love using filter drive, and then you've got tubes and transistors and then capacitors and all these kinds of things you can overdrive to create interesting results. And one final thing that's worth a special mention here is also driving the desks. And Source Direct had a Mackie desk, and absolutely this was like the most common trick in those days for drum and bass artists, was driving the inputs on their desk channels and creating saturation that way by clipping the desk. But there's a really good plugin for those of you who don't have access for an analog desk. This plugin, it's free by Air Windows, and it's called Maxity. It's basically modeled on those Mackie mixes, and it's a great thing you can use to get some of that old school sound into your DAW. One of the results of compression and saturation is that you will quite often smear some of the transient response of the breaks or of the drum sounds, and actually using a transient shaper like this one from Native Instruments after saturation or compression is a really good way to add some of that attack back into the sound. Now, another slightly less well-known form of saturation is exciting, and this is essentially just saturating the high frequencies. So you can do this in a plugin like Saturn, where you just lock it into kind of above 3K and just saturate these upper bands here is a good way to do this. And so you can excite the top end, and that's going to make your break sound brighter. And it's a little bit different from using an EQ and just using a high shelf EQ, because you're actually going to be adding new harmonics when you're using exciters. But the reason I've mentioned this here is because the actual EMU, you can see this one behind me, it has a Aphex aural exciter in it, and so Source Direct would definitely have used that EMU to excite their breaks and to add a bit of brightness to them. There is actually, Waves has done a emulation of this aural exciter here, which you can get as a plugin, and I do think the one on the EMU sounds great. It sounds a little bit different from the plugin version, but I think both the Aphex exciter and just something like a multi-band saturation plugin are both really good ways you can use if you want to excite your breaks. And so if I just show you a quick little A/B here, this is the original break. So you get the idea there, they're all just adding high frequencies in slightly different ways, but they're an interesting process to think about. Now, once again, if you haven't got access to an old hardware sampler like this, there's two really great plugins I can recommend, and one's Decimal and one's this RX950. When you actually listen to this RX950, and you listen to the way it's actually doing the sample rate conversion, it's using filters alongside the sample rate conversion when it's pulling down. And here in this Decimal, you actually have a lot more control over these filters. So you can see I've got this Approx filter and this Images filter here. And so you can tune these up a bit more in Decimal. But I just want to show you, if you're using other sort of plugins for doing your sample rate reduction, you might have something that sounds a lot more like this. Gives you that really kind of pixely, crunchy sound. But to get a more accurate way of how these old samplers would do it, I think you want to actually use something with some filters in it. So you're still getting that crunch, but the filters are pulling out a lot of the kind of pixely stuff. Another very common technique to achieve that sample rate conversion sound, or that crunchy lo-fi sound, is this pitch up, pitch down technique. You would take a record that was supposed to be played at 33 RPM, and then you would speed that up to 45, and then you could actually pull up the pitch fader as well. So you're getting the maximum speed out of a break, and then you would resample that into your hardware sampler and then pitch it back down in the sampler. What's really interesting about this technique is, yes, you're reducing the sample rate, because every time you pitch something down by an octave, you're actually going to halve its speed, and that's also going to halve its sample rate. But we're also going to impart the characteristics of the hardware sampler and its pitching algorithm into the drum break. So you're getting a few things, as well as doing the sample rate conversion, you're getting a few extra things that are also going to happen with the break. Another thing I quickly want to touch on is reverb, and rather than going into the best settings for reverbs, I think I just want to kind of highlight maybe a few common practices to get reverbs to sound good when applying them to drum breaks like this. And the first thing is, I'm actually going to use a bus to do this, because I want to add some extra processing to the break. So using this is like a small realistic room, 0.17 seconds. So smaller size rooms are going to sound better for your breaks, and they're going to just be act more like a glue and sit there in the background than using kind of big halls and chambers and things like that. So small rooms are a good place to start for more subtle reverb settings. And then another thing, a very common thing to do, is to pull out some of the kick or the rumble of the EQ. And so just a low cut on your reverb on the send is going to be another thing that's going to help that reverb to mix and merge better with your break. And then finally, and this is something that kind of bemused me for ages, and one of the main reasons I could never get reverbs to sound good with my breaks is because I would always have them in stereo but the breaks in mono. And actually, if you take a drum break in mono and use a mono reverb with it, it sounds a lot more cohesive, and I'll show you this now. And once again, I'm using this BX control just to mono out this break. But if you listen here, the break's in the middle and the reverb's acting in a space around it. But if I actually put on this mono reverb, it sounds so much better. It sounds so much more realistic because the break is in mono and the reverb is in mono. So that might be something that will really help some of you out, is to actually put your reverbs in mono. Another useful thing to do with your drum breaks is to do some parallel processing, and I've actually separated this from the compression and distortion I talked about earlier in this tutorial, because I just wanted to show this one technique where you set up a kind of bus here. So I've got the original break, and then I've got two sends. One's going to a parallel compression, one's going to parallel distortion, and they're both set on pre-fader. And so what this means is I can set the levels right, and then I can mess with the levels of all of these three breaks to mix and merge the distorted version, the compressed version, and the original drum break. And so just by ear, you can get some really interesting results doing this. So if I just mute this off, I've got my original break here. And so what I can do is sort of bring in some compression and bring down the level of the original break. That's given me that much more slammed compression sound, so maybe I want something in the middle of the two. And then maybe let's see what adding some distortion is going to sound, or some parallel distortion is going to do to this break. So you can hear there the break's actually sounding a lot more aggressive, and it gives these parallel compression and parallel distortion, for my ears anyway, it just gives the breaks more energy and vibe, and it fills up some of the space around the hit, so it brings up some of the room sound and things like that. So the last step in your drum break processing is almost always going to be a limiter or a clipper. And generally the idea here is we're just trying to increase the overall loudness of the break by reducing some of the peak level. And here we've got this nice view in this clipper, and so you can just see as I just increase this by a dB or two, we can see we start to clip off some of the peaks, but we're not getting into the body of the hits and too much of the rest of the break. We're just trying to shave off the real spiky transients, generally as transparently as we can in order to achieve a bit more loudness with our breaks. Okay, so that's really it for me today, and I just thought it would be useful before I go into my next tutorial and specifically start breaking down the amen I did for the secret liaison track. I just wanted to give you a brief overview of all the tools that are at your disposal when you're thinking about processing your drum breaks. So I might even go and upload these two videos both at the same time, just so they're nicely together for the series. And then I will probably catch you in another week or so with my next tutorial going through drum break programming and really getting into this track a little bit more in Renoise. So that's going to be a fun one coming up. And yeah, keep well until then. Peace.